it's the Illuminati, sometimes it's the One World Order, or all these different things. And the thing with it is that sometimes conspiracies are true. Most of the times. Okay, we'll have to have a chat afterwards. But anyway, in spite of that, there's still issues with the whole thing, and I'll briefly cover it, and then maybe at some point we have in fact, even afterwards, if you guys have questions or comments you want to make, I could probably take a few minutes of questions, because I think I'll finish faster than usual. Okay, so some characteristics. Not everybody's familiar with this terminology, but unfalsifiable is something you say when a person makes a claim and it's impossible to prove that claim wrong. Like, for example, somebody might say, okay, here's a group and they've done something, but they've erased all the evidence that they've done it. Well, if they erased all the evidence, there's no way to figure out if they actually done it. So there's no way to know. Another feature that a lot of times you see when you examine many conspiracy theories across the board is what's called ad hoc revisions. Oh man, what is with this thing? Something keeps... I'm bumping something, I don't know what it is though. I'll try to not move as much. So ad hoc revisions is if they make a claim and then you come back and you say, no, that claim cannot be true because of this evidence. When you present the evidence, they change the claim to fit your evidence. So they say, no, because, okay, here's some modification, so the claim is still true. And then you come up and you dig up additional evidence, and then they readjust the claim to fit that evidence. So in this way, you could never disprove something, because really it's just believed on faith, and no matter what evidence you presented, it's not going to change. Another key element with these theories is that it's impossible to really know they're true, because if it's so covert, if it's happening so underground that nobody knows it's happening, then how do you know it's happening? There's just no source of evidence for you to base that on, you know? So these are some of the features. Sometimes some of these stories require more things to be true than the story they're claiming is false. So I'm kind of staying away from giving specific examples, because I don't, you know, there might be somebody in the congregation that will say, no, I believe that theory and I don't want to cause problems that way. But, you know, a friend of mine came on Facebook a few years ago when we had this bombing at a marathon, I believe. I can't remember right now the city. It was Boston Marathon, right? And immediately after that happened, the person came on Facebook and claimed that the whole story was made up. And I just thought to myself, like, how much work it would take to make something like that up? I mean, like, people could actually travel there and talk to the people that were hurt by the event and see the damage and see all this stuff. So to make all that stuff up would be a lot harder than for it actually to have happened, you know? So that's some of the issues with some of these theories. And the theories sometimes get really wild, but sometimes they're somewhat credible, and it's the credible ones that are trickier to deal with. I mean, I've heard theories about people saying that a lot of the leaders in today's world are actually aliens, and they're dressed up as human beings and we can't tell them apart, and things like that. So there's all kinds of wild stuff out there. Now, one of the things conspiracy theory proponents will say is that you know, these things never make it in the news because the news is part of the machine. You know, the news channels are actually involved in the conspiracy, and that's why these things don't actually come out in the news. But the reality is, when you really follow journalism, journalists love a good story, right? So if there was an actual conspiracy, they would want to figure it out. They would want to dig in and like come up with evidence, and they show it to the world, because that's how they win their Pulitzer Prize, right? That's the thing that makes for good journalism. So, you know, all these different elements come together and make us conspiracy theories difficult to take seriously. So now, again, I don't want to offend people that maybe do believe in various theories out there, But unfortunately, in today's society, when you espouse any kind of conspiracy theory, you're automatically causing a certain segment of the population not to take you seriously anymore. So, usually people that are more educated, that are better off economically or whatever, they just don't believe those things no matter what. So, a sure way to cause yourself not to be taken seriously is to start talking about these things. So, again, this is not, what I'm saying here is not to convince somebody to change. Sorry about all this noise.
I think it's hitting your keys.
It's hitting your keys.
Oh, wow. Thanks for noticing that. I'll definitely do it. Let's hope that stops. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm not trying to convince you to change your beliefs. I'm more concerned with our message as a church and not mixing this stuff in with our message. Okay?
Amen.
So I just said that. Basically mixing the Adventist message with conspiracies. Okay, now, Adventists, one of the reasons we're prone to these kinds of things is because we actually do spend a lot of time talking about prophecy, okay? But in Bible prophecy, we don't have all the specific details that you get in conspiracy theories. Bible prophecy speaks about big world events that are undeniable in history, okay? So we have, the four kingdoms, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. Everybody agrees that those existed. There's no conspiracy, there's no doubt, there's no question. When I go to the Bible and I do the Daniel's image with the head of gold and the shoulders and all that stuff, and I show how that compares to actual history, I'm not making anything up. Everybody's in agreement that happened, right? And the beast of Daniel 7 and all that. So there's no conspiracy there, it's not anything fanciful. Then we talk about 1,260 years. Different Christians disagree on those dates, but nobody disagrees that there was this long period of time during which the Church of Rome pretty much ruled Europe, ruled Western Europe, right? That's history. There's no doubt there. What is the purpose of prophecy that we see? Prophecy is not given to us for to stifle our curiosity. Some people are. Is given to us for. Satan's organization and they're doing this and they're going to do that. There's all this stuff they have no figure out in their head. All that stuff. It's not to bring about fear-based conversion. Like some other torment. They use hell to scare people into the church sometimes, right? Adventists sometimes use some of this prophetic conspiracy to scare people into the church in the same way. But that's not what it's for. We're not supposed to bring people to Christ using fear.
Amen.
That doesn't work. And finally, it's not there, Bible prophecy is not there for us to know when Jesus will return. We're not told when Jesus is going to return. That's not something we're supposed to know. Okay, so why do Adventists spend time on Bible prophecy? We use it to establish biblical authority. Now, there's actually a reason for this. Most of Christianity, the way they establish the authority of Christianity itself and the Bible in general is by using philosophical arguments. Even up to today, like if you turn on the radio to listen to a debate between a professional atheist debater and a professional Christian debater, they're going to spend several hours, depending on how long the debate is, discussing philosophy first. And only later they get to actual Christian beliefs. But they use philosophy to prove the existence of God, and then they switch over to specifically Christian beliefs. Well, Adventists moved away from that, first of all, because we wanted to build a belief structure that's mostly centered in Scripture as opposed to having philosophy involved in the process, but also because a lot of these philosophical arguments don't work very well anymore. So today when you see debates with atheists, a lot of times the atheists are actually getting ahead in the debate because the philosophical arguments, they used to work 1,000 years ago, but today, because of all the scientific advancements, they don't really add up. And it's hard for me to explain that in a few seconds, but Adventism has moved away from the philosophy part, so we've worked to establish biblical authority by pointing to the prophecies. Because the fact that God can predict world events thousands of years in advance shows that the Bible can be taken seriously. You know, it's not just a made-up book. Okay, so now this is something specific for us as Adventists. We use prophecy to tell us when the time is to start preaching the 3 angels' messages. I don't have time to explain this too much, but those of you who have been in the church for a while kind of know what this means. And then finally, it helps us to bring about, to present a set of predictions for the future by which people, starting from there again, by which people could kind of tell that we're in the time of the end. So basically, what we're doing as Adventists, we're saying, look, there's many different types of Christians today, and different groups of Christians approach their beliefs in different ways. You know, so this group reads the Bible this way and they come to certain conclusions. Here's another group, they come to different conclusions. This group comes to their own conclusions. But just because different Christians disagree on different topics doesn't mean that these guys will be lost and only those guys will be saved. God can work with all of them. God can still save Christians regardless of their different beliefs. But the Bible tells us that at the end of time, God is trying to bring His people together into one group and differentiate them from Satan's people into a different group, right? So we see this picture in the Bible at the end of time where God separates everybody into 2 groups of people, okay? So in order to do that, the approach we have to prophecy is basically gives us this tool. It says, okay, we come and approach the Bible a certain way. And when we follow this line of reasoning, it's mostly mathematical, like it's logical. Somebody can listen to what we're saying and say, yeah, it all comes together and makes sense. When we follow a certain line of reasoning, it gives us certain predictions, okay? So we look at prophecy and we say, okay, here's a list of predictions. If our way of thinking is correct, then these events should happen in sometime in the future. If they don't happen, oh well, doesn't mean anything. But if they happen, then other Christians could say, yeah, they probably have the right approach to Scripture. So then we can have a basis for coming together and saying, yeah, okay, we could all understand what you're doing, and we could understand why it all comes together this way, because you were able to predict this thing several decades, 100-something years in advance. Okay, does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So there's a predictive element to prophecy, but this is very different than a conspiracy theory, because this is stuff that's, if we're right about it, it's going to happen publicly and nobody's going to be able to deny it. And if we're wrong, then it doesn't hurt anything, right? It's just a prediction, like the way scientists make predictions and test their theories and figure out if they're right or wrong. Okay, so within our way of thinking, we have this concept of the great controversy. This is just a very brief summary, but what we're saying is this, that from the time of creation till this particular point in time, 1844, the reason God allows sin to exist is as a demonstration of the effects of sin. So that for the rest of eternity, people are never going to want to sin again. They're never going to want to rebel against God again, because they're going to be able to look back and say, this is what happened the last time Satan rebelled. We don't ever want to do that again because we've seen the effects of it. And God allowed several thousand years of human history to advance so the whole universe can see the effects of sin. So there's this long time of demonstration. But according to our understanding of prophecy, there was a time here in 1844 where God said, okay, enough, we've had enough, we've seen enough, the demonstration has been going on long enough for us to get sufficient evidence. So now there's a time of evaluation of that. You know, the angels, all the heavenly beings, they could come together and say, let's see what are the results of this demonstration. And when we're done with the evaluation, then Jesus will come in and this will be over. And he'll put an end to human history. So there's 2 parts here. there's the evaluation that takes place in heaven, and there's our part on earth where we prepare the world for the end of the world. And unfortunately, some of this stuff, unless you've heard me talk about it before, it's not going to make a lot of sense in a few minutes that I have today. But I'm just briefly going over it now. So these are the predictions we're making as a church, according to Revelation 13. So we believe that Catholicism and Protestantism are going to come together again, even though they split up almost 500 years ago. We believe that together they're going to break the separation between church and state, and they're going to take control of the state. We believe that it's going to start in America, and then America is going to become the example for the rest of the world to do the same that we're doing here. And then they're going to use civil laws to enforce religious observances, religious requirements. And then they're going to use persecution to force people to obey these laws. So those are the predictions we're making as a church. If we're wrong about this, we're wrong. But if we're right, that means the process that we have used this whole time to interpret the Bible must have been correct. Because how else could this happen if our process wasn't correct? It's too wild a prediction for it to happen if we're not following the right process. Okay, so everything else we have no way of knowing. Like all the different details that people talk about in conspiracy theories, the Bible doesn't give us any information on that. We're not, any other more specific details that people come up with, we don't know from the Bible. And if we don't know from the Bible, we don't know from any other source, because like I explained already, the only access to knowledge we have is whatever access everybody else has to knowledge. So if certain things are happening in secret, we have no way of knowing that it's true or not. It could be true, but there's no way to prove it. So if we cannot prove it, why bother believing it, thinking about it, telling other people about it? There's no way to know that it's true. Now, I'm saying this here, there's no credible evidence, and I'm talking specifically about certain ministries in our church that have produced materials on all kinds of claims regarding things that are happening in the background and secret societies doing this and that. And I've listened to hours and hours, probably 50 hours worth of material. But these materials that, videos and things that are put out there, they present a lot of lines of evidence, but those lines of evidence themselves are not credible. And just because you give a lot of it, if you compile a lot of non-credible evidence together, it doesn't automatically make it credible. Yeah. The amount of it doesn't change the validity of it, right? Mm-hmm. So this is something I'm saying personally to people that follow this ministries. I don't think any of this stuff is actually credible and worth taking seriously. And I believe it actually hurts our cause as a church, because when people hear us talking about, this particular group is doing this in secret and they've done this and that, people stop taking us seriously about the other stuff we're saying that actually has credibility, because it's in scripture, it's in history, it actually happened, there's no doubt about it. And, if you lose credibility with people, then they're actually not going to listen to you to the stuff you're saying that actually matters. Okay, what about the end of the world? Okay, so we are, let's say history is going back this way, and we're here today. I haven't really got into this, but we have this belief in the Sunday law being passed, and then all these other events, the loud cries, 7 plagues, close of probation, second coming, all these things are supposed to happen. The problem is, there's this period of time here, and we have no idea how long it's going to be. The Bible doesn't tell us, God doesn't tell us, nobody knows. It could be a year, it could be 100 years, we have no idea, and we're not going to know until this happens. So it's only once the government takes over, in the sense that the church and the government unite and they decide to pass laws that force people to do things that are religious in nature, that the government has no business doing. It's not until that happens that the rest of these events that we talk about as Adventists are going to take place. So The loud cry is when the latter rain comes down. The preaching of the gospel to the end of the world, the 7 last plagues, the close of probation, all these things that we talk about as Adventists, all these things are going to happen, but they're only going to happen after this point. And we have no way of knowing when this is going to happen until it actually happens. So there's never a time when we're going to say, hey, we're really close, we're really close. Because the way it works is that we see world events and they look like they're progressing towards that point, but then something happens and there's a delay. And then they look like they're progressing towards that point and there's a delay. And whenever God is ready, things are going to happen all the way to there. But we don't know where we are in the cycle, right? And we're never going to know until it actually happens. So there's no point in worrying about it. So I know people today that are very convinced that in a few months something major is going to happen. But if they lived 20 years ago or 40 years ago, they would have been just as convinced back then. And if they lived 80 years ago, they would have been just as convinced back then. Because there's always something happening in the world that looks like it's at the very end, like we're coming very close to the end of history. And we're just not going to know. So there's no point in worrying about this, there's no point in stressing out about it, or using those things as a way to convince people of the gospel, to try to use conspiracies or current events to try to bring people to Christ, because when your predictions don't happen, it makes them to doubt the Bible even more than they did before. So it's actually going to work against you. This is a passage from, what's going on? Okay, this is a passage from Daniel 11, and I'm not speaking about Daniel 11 right now, but I just want to show you this, how Daniel 11 talks about there's going to be a king of the south, and he's going to do all this stuff. Then there's the king of the north, and he's doing all this stuff. And then the king of the south comes against him and kind of defeats him a little bit, but then the king of the north comes against him from the other side. There's all this back and forth, and essentially what we have in all of human history is some of the kingdoms of the world, they pull in one direction, and then other opposing forces pull in another direction. And it keeps going back and forth, and it's going to keep doing that until the end of time. So there's no way to know. Okay, so my appeal to all this, yes, I don't know what's happening. Yeah, my appeal to all this is that I don't think concerning ourselves with all the events happening in the world, with all the secret stuff going behind the scenes, I don't think it's helpful to us spiritually. It's not bringing us closer to Christ. It could cause discouragement if we expect something to happen and it doesn't happen. It causes us to lose credibility when we're actually trying to tell people stuff that is supported and is defensible. People no longer take us seriously. And finally, even if somebody wants to believe these things, hey, by all means, I'm not here to tell you what you believe, but please don't mix it with the Adventist message, because it's hurting everybody's efforts to reach people for Christ. And also, I would say, don't support ministries that are pushing these things, because it's not helpful to our movement, it's not helpful to our church. So that's all I have for today. I guess it wasn't as short as I thought, but it's still not as long as it could have been. Any thoughts or questions before we close? We could always talk about it later, but if anybody has something they want me to address right now, I can take 1 or 2 questions. No? I know if I preach this sermon at some of my other churches, it will be different, but I'll leave that for later. Okay, let's bow our heads then and close out the word of prayer. Father in heaven, I don't know exactly how much the things I talked about today apply to this particular congregation. I know some of these things are a problem in our church as a whole. And Father, I pray that you give all of us wisdom to be able to discern what things are crucial, what things matter, what things we should be talking about with other people, and what things we probably should just keep to ourselves or not really even worry about, because it's not really our business to know what Satan is doing behind the scenes or how he's going to go about accomplishing his plans. He's going to do his thing, and you're in charge, and you're the one that decides when the end is going to happen and when you're going to return. And it's not up to the Pope, it's not up to Satan, it's not up to secret societies or anybody else. And I pray that you'll help us to know that and to trust you and be ready for whatever happens, regardless of whether your coming is in a few days or in a few years or longer. Let us be ready at all times, because we have no idea how much longer we're going to be here. I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Amen.